Okay, so today's lesson is on simple quadratic equations. Now, quadratic equations sounds like a big, scary thing, but it's just a new little twist on what we've already been doing. So you'll know from now we've had questions like, for instance, wrong pen. We've had questions like, for instance, 3x plus 6 equals 9. All right. And when we solve those ones, well, we'll go through this one very quickly, but we know what we've got to do. We've got to undo any addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division by doing the opposite. And whatever we do to one side, we have to do to the other. So in this particular one, I've got x is being multiplied by 3, and it's having 6 added to it. So I've got to undo those, undoing addition and subtraction first. So let's undo that plus 6 by minusing 6. If I do that, that'll all cancel out, which gets rid of the 6 from that side. But of course, because whatever I do to one side, I have to do the other, I'll have to take away 6 from that side. So that's going to leave me with 3x equals, 9 minus 6, which is 3. Okay, and then the next step we've got to take is we've got to say, well, hang on a second, what's going on with x now? It's being multiplied by 3. What's the opposite of being multiplied by 3? Well, it's dividing by 3. So I'll have to do that to both sides. And if I divide by 3, those two are going to cancel each other out. And that's just going to leave x on this side. And 3 divided by 3, well, that's just 1. Now, importantly, if I go back to my equation, and I'm just going to get rid of this little stroke I put through there just so I can see my equation. If I take this and I go back in to there and I say, well, let's substitute x equals 1 into that equation. So essentially what I'm saying is, well, if I use that as a formula to work out if it's right, 3 times by 1 is 3, plus 6 is 9. So it works as a solution. And it's the only solution that will work. There's no other number you can put into that equation that will, into the left-hand side of that equation that'll equal the right-hand side. The answer has to be 1. Okay. Today we're going to work with some quadratic equations, and they're slightly different. There's a little extra thing going on. But the first thing I want to do is I want you to hop on your calculator and work out for me what 3 squared is. Now, importantly, I don't want you to type 3 times 3. I want you to hop in your calculator. You'll pause the video if you need to, and just press 3 and then squared. And we see that that's 9. Okay, and I don't think most of you probably knew that off the top of your head. The next thing I want you to do is I want you to do minus 3 squared. All right. Now, really important here, I want you to make sure you use the brackets just like I have. So let's just put that in there, a bracket, minus 3, close brackets, squared. All right. And we'll see, hang on a second, that equals 9 as well. Let's just think about that for a second. Why does that equal 9? Well, I guess that's because minus 3 squared is the same as minus 3 times minus 3. And when we multiply two numbers together, we multiply the numbers together first. 3 times 3 is 9. And then we work out what the signs are. And we've got a negative times a negative, so we're going to get a positive. So that kind of makes sense. That actually sits pretty well with where we're at the moment. Given that minus 3 squared just means minus 3 times minus 3, and a minus times a minus gives us a positive, that all makes sense. Now, there's just one other little thing I want you to do for me. Be very careful with this. If I put minus 3 squared into my calculator, minus 3 squared in my calculator, it's going to give me minus 9. And that's because the calculator doesn't know what you want. It only can act on what you've told it. And what you've told it is to square 3 and then make it negative. All right? So just be aware that this way of doing things is not very good. Whenever you're squaring a negative number, you should always put it in brackets. And that way you get the actual correct answer, because minus 3 times minus 3 is 9. I'm going to come back to that idea in a second, but I want you to understand that there's two numbers I can square to get 9, either 3 or minus 3. Okay, so as we head on down to have a look at what quadratic equations are equations where we have a square in it. So here we've got x squared equals 9 in this first example just here. X squared equals 9. So in order to work out what x equals. We don't really want to know what x squared equals. In all equations, we're trying to, if we're asked to solve the equation, we want to get to the stage of saying x or y or whatever letter it is equals something. Not x squared equals something, x equals something. So we're going to have to undo that square, and the thing to undo a square is to take the square root. So squaring and square roots are opposites of each other, just like multiplication and division are opposites, addition and subtraction are opposites, squaring and the square root are opposites. Okay, but when we take the square root of 9 on our calculator, so if we were working on this one, if I put the square root of 9 in my calculator, the calculator is only going to give me the positive answer. It's only going to give me the answer of 3. All right. Now 3 is the square root of 9, but there is another number that I can multiply by itself and get 9. I can take minus 3 times by minus 3, and that will give me positive 9. So there's 2 answers. And so with quadratic equations, you're either going to have 2 solutions, which is going to be the case a lot of the time, where the answer is just going to be plus or minus the square root of the number. So in this case, 9. So if x squared equals 9, then x equals plus or minus 3. All right, we don't know which one. Depends on the circumstance. Sometimes we do. But there's 2 possible solutions to that equation instead of 1. This equation we looked at up here, it had only 1 solution. X squared equals 9 has 2 solutions. Now, sometimes there can be only 1 solution, and that's in that very specific circumstance where you have x squared equals 0. Because 0 squared is 0. 0 can't be negative. It's kind of neither negative or positive. So it only has 1 solution. The other thing too is if we try to take the square root of a negative number, our calculator says math error. And so what we say there is that there's no real solutions. Mathematicians just didn't give up there because the calculator said math error. There is a whole area of maths that deals with square roots of negative numbers. And if you want to learn more about that, you've got to do Extension 2 Mathematics in Year 11 and 12. But in Year 8, we don't need to worry about it. We just have to say there's no real solutions. I think it says here no solutions. No real solutions is just a smidge bit better, but no solutions is fine. Okay. So how do we do this in practice? Let's have a go at a few examples. So I want you to get the sheet in front of you and I want you to fill this out as we go through it. So with x squared equals 25, I've got to find out what x equals. So if I took the square root of x squared, well, that would just equal x. The square root kind of cancels out the square. So that's good. But of course, whatever I do to one side, I've got to do to the other. So if I took the square root of one side, I've got to take the square root of the other. And the square root of 25 is 5. We can check that on our calculator. We just go square root. That math error is hanging around. I've just got to get rid of it. There we go. Square root of 25 is 5. But we have to remember whenever we do this in equations and we take the square root, that if the answer given on the calculator is 5, we have to remember that actually there's also a negative case. So it has to be either plus or minus 5. Okay. In the next one, that looks a little bit more complicated, but we can solve that. First things first, we can get rid of that 3 that's in front of the x. It's in front of the x squared, sorry, should I say. The x squared is being multiplied by 3. So the opposite of being multiplied by 3 is to divide by 3. So I'll have to do that to both sides. That's going to cancel those 3's out. I'm going to be left with x squared equals 25, because 75 divided by 3 is 25. And then much like the previous one, I'll have to take the square root of x squared to find out what x is, which means I need to take the square root of 25. So that's going to give me x equals plus or minus. Just be ready to write that in every time you take a square root in algebra. Okay, so that's our answer there. Now in the final one, x squared equals minus 25. So our first step to find out what x squared equals, we'd have to take the square root of that side. But of course, whatever we do to one side, we have to do to the other. So there we go. We'll take the square root of negative 25 and we'll run across to our calculator and put in the square root of negative 25, and our calculator says math error. So this is a situation where we can say there's no real solutions. And in this case, that is the correct answer to that question. To say there's no solution is the correct answer, okay? And being able to spot that is actually a skill, okay? So sometimes there are math questions that are impossible to solve, at least with the mathematics we have so far, okay? There is a way to work with negative square roots, but as I said, it's something you have to do top-level high school maths to see, or if you go and do maths at university, you do a lot of stuff on that. Okay, so just working through the left-hand side, following the same process again. In order to find out what a is, I'm going to have to take the square root of a squared. And of course, if I take the square root of a squared, I'll have to also take the square root of 4. The square root of a squared is just going to give me a, and the square root of 4 is going to be 2, but I have to remember that there's a negative case as well, because negative 2 times negative 2 would give me 4 as well. So it's always just plus or minus the square root. We don't have, although there's two solutions, there's never ever two solutions that are completely different. It's just we take the square root and it's plus or minus whatever that square root is. Once again, if there's a coefficient in front of our letter, we can deal with that first. So in this case, 4b squared equals 36. So I can divide by 4 to get rid of that 4 in front of the b squared. But of course, I'm going to have to do that to both sides. So I'm going to end up with b squared equals, now 36 divided by 4. I could use my calculator, or you might just know that's 9. And of course, now I'm going to have to take the square root of b squared to find out what b is. But that means I'm also going to take the square root of 9. So we're going to end up with b equals plus or minus 3. Okay. And in this last example, I'm just going to move this up on the page a little bit. First things first, I'll have to get rid of that coefficient of y squared. So if I divide by negative 2, that'll get rid of negative 2 in front of there. That'll leave me with just y squared. That's good. I'll divide this side by negative 2 as well. So I'll rewrite the equation, and now we've got y squared equals negative 9. So obviously the next step would be to say, well, let's take the square root of both sides. But hang on a second, on that right-hand side there, that's a negative number. So I can't take the square root of a negative number. So I have to recognize that this is also a case where there's no real solutions. Okay, so what I expect is everybody to have that little section here filled out. Oops, sorry, that's come up. This little handout here, I want you to all have it filled out just like it is here on the screen. Okay, and then you to go on to your work there in exercise 2F on page 77. So there's the questions there I'd like you to have a go at. 1 and 3 should be done pretty quickly. Okay, the main thing I want you to be focusing on is 4, 5, 6. Okay, now with 4, they're all perfect squares, so they'll come out as nice even numbers. But with 5, if I, for instance, that first one, the square root of, x squared equals 6, if I take the square root of both sides, I'm going to have to take the square root of 6 to work that one out, and it's going to give me an ugly number. All right, so you'll see here in the question it says just state it to 2 decimal places, because lots of square roots make really ugly numbers. All right, so we'll deal with that a little bit more in year 9. But yeah, we just have to be used to that. So not all of them come out as nice, even, beautiful numbers. And then question 6 asks you about whether or not there's going to be 1, 2, or no solutions for each of those. And for those of you that are pushing up there and having a go, 9 is a little bit harder, but not impossible. Just a little bit more work. And 12 is a really good one to test your knowledge of the area. So if you're finding this easy, make sure you have a go at some of those in 12. If you're working from OneNote, I have the answers in the other tab here. However, if you've got the textbook, obviously the answers are at the back of the book. But remember, your answers aren't as important as your solutions. Make sure you write good solutions. And that's it for this lesson.